Hi, Camille. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Exploring the Inner Addict, Part 4 with Lisa Sarimi. My name is Nicole, and I'm on the Access Elite team that has brought this event to you. For those of you who aren't familiar, Access Elite is a health and wellness company providing team building, social wellness, and connection through our on demand classes and our live events. We're always so excited to bring some positivity and connection to your day. So I just want to take a moment and thank you all for being here. And with that, let's dive right in. Our guest today is Lisa. She's a transformational coach, a marriage and family therapist, and a yoga therapist. And with that, Lisa, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Nicole. As always, it's so exciting to be here with everyone and to wrap up this series on our inner addict. Today, we're going to be really getting into a little more of like, well, what do I do with this part of myself that maybe you've discovered? So without further ado, let's go ahead and get this party started. All right. So as I mentioned, today we'll look at different ways to regulate the inner addict. This is the fourth piece of our 4-piece series. We're going to do some review as always, just in case you weren't with us for the last 3. We're going to explore addiction today as a coping mechanism. And we're going to discover some alternative ways that we can cope. And then creating outer structures for supporting ourselves. And then really looking at what are the parts of ourselves that may have been abandoned along the way through our journey with addiction. So just as a little review, wanting to bring our attention back to Dr. Carol Clark's definition of addiction. Remembering that addiction is when there's obsessive, compulsive, out of control behavior that is continuously done, regardless of negative consequences that one might experience personally or that maybe another is experiencing. And the archetype, the addict archetype, just like every archetype patterns that exist in our collective, there is light to that archetype, and sometimes there's some shadow too. So in the light, the addict archetype has that ability to recognize and to overcome and heal the inner spirit and the soul to release the addictive tendencies. On the shadow side is when that addiction takes over and it begins to take authority over one's inner spirit. That's how it might arise in the shadow. The addict is always in a dance between control and chaos. And the addiction actually becomes an illusionary sense of control. And then we explored in session 1, like, just being human, we have cravings. There's a lot of like aspects of an addict that we might even identify within ourselves. So how does it kind of shift between these natural cravings as a human, where all of a sudden these cravings take us out of balance in our lives? An addict's voice will a lot of times have kind of the language of I deserve or what about me. And then in part 2, we started to really look at the cycle of addiction because there is a cycle to it. And really, when we started to peel the layers of addiction, what we may have realized is that the addiction is usually some type of stimulus. So it's not the substance or the behavior necessarily, but it is the stimulation that behavior or that substance provides. And then what that does is it elevates us from what we'll call baseline. So let's just take a moment to talk about the brain. The brain recognizes the stimulation and then it releases things like dopamine and adrenaline. And when those things get released, it's like our internal pharmacy feeding this continuous cycle. The addictive cycle actually arises because there is some need to escape. When we talk today about how addiction can actually be a coping mechanism, this might make more sense. So, what happens is at first, the stimulation of choice begins to release these feel good hormones. And then eventually, the addict's brain doesn't really care where the stimulation is coming from. It only wants what it wants. And it'll put into motion even chains of events just to get that stimulation. And when it finds a replacement, if a regular one is not available, it will go with that. So the addict brain is always about craving and stimulation. It's either thinking about it, it's preparing a way for it, it's receiving it, or it's recovering from the effects of it. And addiction is not linear. It's not like you go A, B, C, D, E. It's actually very, very circular in nature. So last week, we kind of went over how addiction can show up in different ways. We've kind of been touching on it throughout our series, but the main two categories we see a lot of is substance addiction, right? So that's the external substances that can take our mood from baseline. So if this is baseline, the stimulation is going to take us up, increasing feelings of pleasure. Okay. And then we get used to this, right? And so then if we stop doing the thing that elevated us up from baseline, it actually begins to feel like we're dropping down. Okay. And so these substances are ways that help us feel like we're regulating our mood, although that's not really what's happening. And some of the substances we're familiar with: alcohol, cocaine, marijuana, prescription drugs, right? The thing that comes in a bottle with the doctor's prescription, but also can become an addiction. Methamphetamines, hallucinogens. We're going to get into a review in a moment here and look at some of the most popular substances as well. And then there's behavioral addiction. So these are not substances, these are actually behaviors, but because of the internal release of pharmacology, we still get that stimulation. And so some of the behavioral addictions, even though food is something external, you might think it's a substance, its addiction is really more behavioral. Pornography, exercise, love, internet use, video games. So experts agree that addiction, it's really a disease. It's not something that just willpower usually can tend to, right? So we want to look at addiction from that perspective and stop. I think this is one of the reasons why in a lot of 12-step programs, and we're going to talk a little bit about 12-step programs, why they're so important and effective is because the addiction or the substance or the behavior is actually not given so much power. And what I mean by that is the power is allocated to a higher power, something outside of ourselves. And it's a big shift because when we're in addiction, the higher power becomes the addiction, whether it's the behavior or it's the substance. So just a review of some of the most common behavioral addictions: gambling, sex, internet, shopping, video games, plastic surgery. And with food, it's not just the eating, but it could be the behavior of binging or vomiting, right? If it's the constrictive type of food disorder. So, and then there's also risky behavior, right? So there's certain things that happen in our body when we're in risky situations or situations that kind of require us to be more vigilant and mobilized. And we can also get behaviorally addicted to those states. Substances are things, as I mentioned earlier, but then also up here in order, we got alcohol, tobacco, opioids, those prescription drugs, cocaine, cannabis, amphetamines, hallucinogens, inhalants, PCP. And then we got a little reminder that our inner addict can manifest in our lives in many, many different ways. And what the inner addict is seeking is really the stimulation. It'll continue to find various ways to satiate that craving for stimulation. So it is truly the addiction to the production of those substances internally, like dopamine, that makes us feel good, and that will take a behavior from something that's normal to something that we're addicted to. So at some point, there's a breaking point, and that dopamine production no longer feels satiating. And that's kind of what breaks it into addiction, because you got to get more of it, more of it, more of it. And the stimulation, whether it's the behavior or a substance, is where we kind of will see that loop start to formulate. So with all of that said, what I'd like to also bring forward, and this is something that I talk to a lot of my clients about, especially when I'm working with addiction, is that, we have to consider that addiction, whether it's a behavior or a substance, was there with a purpose. The addiction didn't start as this cycle we were stuck in. The addiction started because we had some type of pain, some type of suffering, and the substance or the behavior that began the cycle gave us a way to cope, right? And a lot of times when we're kids, we don't have the same resources for coping. We're still developing, right? So a lot of this can always root back to like our childhoods, our families, the containers we've grown up with. The good news is that, most likely we're adults now, and there's so many ways that we can take care and tend to those childhood wounds and find other ways to cope with past trauma, abuse, neglect, cultural, societal, communal, or ancestral wounds. Now, we all have this nervous system in our bodies, and we have a piece of our nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. And that part really stores a lot of our history, our experiences. And what it does, because it's there to serve us, is it will step in without our consciousness, meaning without our thinking mind, with the intention to protect us. Keep that in the back of your head. So when we're experiencing pain and suffering, the addiction becomes the way to tend to the pain. Now, we might think of the pain or those unwelcomed feelings as really messengers that are there to kind of help us understand what our needs are. So if we start to work with the wound a little differently, and what I mean by that, so what's going to happen if we choose to stop a particular behavior or substance use, we're going to start to feel. We're going to start to feel. And we might start to feel feelings that we weren't even present to before. And so we got to figure out, as we start to feel these old feelings that we've been really repressing in such a powerful way, how are we going to tend to them? How are we going to bring in new ways to cope with these feelings and these sensations that our entire body is starting to experience? And when I say whole body or your wholeness, I'm not just talking about the physical body. I'm talking about mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And then we can start to discover new ways to replace. Here's the thing I will tell you for sure. When you are looking to replace or to heal an addiction, you've got to find another coping mechanism. You've got to find another way to tend to that wound and to work with that wound if you don't want to relapse. There it is, alternate ways to cope. So this doesn't happen overnight. So I want us to also think that even addiction, whether it's a behavior or a substance, it's a practice, and it's something we get used to practicing every time we're feeling a certain way because it's helping us come back to our a baseline that we have within ourselves as far as how we feel, or it has us come back to a calmer state. So here are some ideas. By the way, I do want to just say, as a therapist and as somebody that's worked with many in the process of healing their wounds, you need to know that when you start that process, it's gonna probably get a little worse before it gets better. So what, in my field, it's like you got to heal it. I'm sorry, you got to feel it to heal it. And so in this work, also, one way to find coping mechanisms is we have to kind of feel into the stressors that are leading us to other behaviors or substances and find new ways or alternative ways to cope. So as a therapist, one of the things that I feel like many of my clients come to the table with, whether they're dealing with addiction or not, is this inner child, right? And maybe you've heard about the inner child before, but I'm talking about inner child work. What the inner child work does is it helps empower us to reparent ourselves and to heal those old wounds that maybe got shut down through our addictions. Now, here's the thing. When I talk to people about inner child work, sometimes they're like, well, I had the best parents. And so I want you to really get, like, just because inner child work means you're working on that younger version of yourself and maybe you're learning ways to reparent. I trust that everybody's parents did the best that they could within the scope of what they could do. Right. So this doesn't mean you had bad parents. It just means that as a child, we have different experiences and we have wounds that are created. And as a child, we're mostly feeling because our brain is still developing. And so what happens is a lot of those wounds, we weren't in a place or a space or in the developed part of our brain to be able to either work through what happened, or to defend ourselves, right? Depending on what happened. And then another way to cope is to find practices of self-love and self-care. Now, a lot of people will be like, well, what's self-love? Maybe it's something you've never heard of before. Whoops. Hold on, don't look at that slide. Okay, self-love is really an act of taking a moment to ask yourself, what do I need? And then listening and then giving yourself what you need. Self-care is asking yourself, what do I need? Taking the time to listen and then giving yourself what you need and actually making yourself important, right? A lot of times in addiction, we also find it couples with something called codependency. Maybe you've heard of that buzzword, maybe you haven't. But what codependency is, in a sense, is it's this continually looking outside of yourself to take care of and tend to other people's needs. And in that, we forget about ourselves. Another, or a way to cope, not just with addiction, but with stress, because I think a lot of times it's the stress behind that causes us to seek ways to cope and that can lead to addiction. It has to do with our nervous system, understanding our nervous system, understanding the gears in the nervous system, and how our nervous system is connected to various emotional states. So when you understand that, you're able to incorporate practices that are going to help maintain optimal states. So an example of that, this morning, I did a sound healing bath and a guided meditation with a group of clients to show them that when we reset the nervous system, starting right out the gates in the morning, that they start their day in such a calmer state, right? It's not the stress activating and putting them in a state that's going to make unpleasant emotions available, rather putting them into a state through the nervous system that is going to make feelings like contentment, peace, and ease more available. The other thing that I see a lot of, and I'm sure, maybe you've heard of, the B word, boundaries. And like really the importance of taking a look at, not only the boundaries that we have created in the relationships in our lives, but the boundaries that we have within ourselves. And if we're honoring those, or if we've even put any down, or maybe just like, where do we struggle with this idea of boundaries? Where do you surrender your psyche over and over and over again because other people are being made more important, or you're not honoring yourself and you don't have those boundaries, right? So as you start to do the process, just like therapy, it's not comfortable at first because something you haven't been doing, right? And it's not just not comfortable for you, it's going to not be comfortable for the people around you. But over time, as you practice, it gets more comfortable. And then you train people what's okay and what's not okay. And then you're going to start to feel better and safer within yourself. And then it's less likely you're going to lead to those addictive behaviors, as well as maybe substance abuse, because you're in this process finding your own empowerment in ways to manage your stress. And I think like the next one is really, really, really powerful, because most of us will do something for someone else before we'll do it for ourselves. So I have found, whether it's healing addiction or even like in the realm of wanting to create something in your life, that the accountability that we can create around us and within us and the structures are going to make a big difference, because we have to wake up to that every day, and that's going to be in place, right? So it makes it a lot harder to go back on our own word. And in that accountability and structure, it also makes us available to be supported, which is nice. The number one question that I have clients ask themselves when they're in their process of healing is, this for my addiction or for my recovery? And when I say, is this what I'm anything, you're going to get up, you're going to read a book with your coffee. Is this book in honor of your recovery, or is it part of your addiction? Is the coffee a part of your recovery, or is it a part of your addiction? And it just kind of becomes this question that you check in with yourself and you ask yourself, because when you're creating new habits, you kind of need to really bring in mindfulness as a way to help regulate your actions, your thoughts, and your behaviors. Those structures of support are so important that I wanted to give them a whole slide. Now, whether you're a fan of 12 steps or you're not a fan of 12 steps, what you want to know is that a 12-step program is a program that's going to create that structure of support for you. It's going to keep you in recovery rather than in your addiction. So the 12-step program has some elements that are really, really powerful. One, the 12 steps in itself are a proven recipe that works. In fact, it's so proven and so powerful that depending on what type of addiction you are healing, you will find that there are different types of 12-step programs. There's ones for AA, and there's ones for drugs called NA, and there's ones for specifically marijuana called MA, not NA, but MA, love addiction, sex addiction, gambling addiction. I mean, they're all out there. It really doesn't matter which one. Codependency. Just getting into a 12-step program puts you into a container and a structure for recovery. And that's the key, is we want to be in that container and structure to be supported in our recovery. And the 12-step program also, when we're looking at that next bullet point, is going to give us a sense of community and connection. They say that what the antidote to addiction is connection. So being in an environment where there's other people that can relate to you, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one that has these feelings or this experience within myself. gives us a space to get stronger together. And then last but not least, of course, I'm biased. I'm a therapist. But I do need to tell you, before I ever became a therapist, I was not into going to therapy. But the power of therapy is that you have another person who's able to really witness and be a sounding board of you. Their job is to fully just listen, right? Think about how many times we talk to a friend or a family member, and most people are not listening. Most people are thinking before you even finish talking about what they're going to say right back to you, the advice they're going to give you, the directions they're going to give you, whatever it is. But in therapy, it's a very sacred relationship because this human that's your therapist is going to work through some of the deep wounds with you, side by side with you. And then within the 12-step program, you also get a sponsor. So if you're in that environment, maybe therapy is outside of your budget or something like that, having that sponsor, it's kind of like having your cheerleader. It's having that person that you can call whenever you're feeling weak. And it's like having a mentor, right? Somebody that can kind of show you the ropes and show you how they did it. How did they get 22 years of sobriety under their belt, 3 years, 20 years, just all the different timelines, right? It's like, okay, this person has been through something similar, and if they can do it, you can do it too. Something that happens, also, this would be something you probably work on more with your therapist, but also just to bring acknowledgement to this idea that when we begin to create an addiction or through that process of creation, a lot of abandonment within ourselves happens. So there's wounds, we can have abandonment wounds. And, it's crazy because like that wound could have been created just because mom stepped away for a minute, not because mom actually abandoned somebody, right? But when we fall into addiction, a lot of times we abandon a lot of the parts inside of ourselves. And when you're working with somebody who's trained, like a therapist, they can support working with you in exploring what parts have you abandoned and how can you integrate those parts back into your life to kind of be your ally and to support you. Reintegration and healing of those abandoned wounds sometimes can be the root of why addiction began. And there's many powerful modalities in this world that you can work with, in this world of psychotherapy, tending to abandoned parts, working with our inner child,
Can you hear me?
healing old wounds. And so we've got internal family systems, EMDR, and yoga therapy is another way that you can tend to these abandoned parts. And this officially completes our series on the inner addict. I do just want to mention that, addiction, it's a really big, real thing. So like this, I hope series, if anything, maybe just begin to open up and expand consciousness of where you might be feeling kind of stuck or held, at hostage within yourself due to an addiction of some sort. And yeah, I just want to open it up for any questions at this point.
Thank you, Lisa. I don't have questions, but I like when you mentioned, like, for example, you grab a book and then you realize, oh, it's part of the addiction. I should either find another topic or find some other different activity that, yeah, we get, those are the traps in life, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like just staying awake and ask and being curious with yourself, like, is what I'm about to do, is it, we could talk about, like, this whole thing was about addiction, but how is this next thing adding to me or taking from me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such an interesting subject, and I think it's relatable to everyone on some level. Um, yeah, I'm kind of racking my mind with what our brain attaches to those pleasure and pain receptors. And I heard something interesting the other day about how if, and it might have been you who said this in the past week, but if we attached like the pain of working out to being something more devastating like cancer treatment, we would not work out because it would be painful for us. But because we attach it to health and wellness and looking good and feeling good, we continue to do it. Um, and we're addicted to that pain. So it's like all a mind frame in that sense. Was it you who said that in the previous week?
I don't think I said that, but I will say that I do know that our biology responds to our mind. So, regardless of what's actually happening, when our mind goes there, our physical body will respond as if it's happening right now, which is really powerful because we are built with a negativity bias, which means we are always looking at how to protect ourselves. And it's kind of like this default way, that we operate. But yeah, so when we're able to just kind of notice that in a way and not go into, you know what, it's like, this is the best way to say it, not let the automatic parts of us that are there to serve us to always be operating, because they bypass the actual thinking brain, because there's no time when your body's trying to protect you to think. But we do need to stop and then think, is what's actually happening, is that reality? Like, is my body responding to a reality that's happening?
Wow, yeah. That's a good distinction to make. The automatic brain versus the thinking brain. I like that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. This was an awesome series. I'm so excited to have these on-demand classes and revisit some of the knowledge that we were able to have here. And I'm looking forward to your next series, whenever that may be. But yeah, thank you guys for tuning in, and we will see you guys all soon. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day.
Yeah.
Thank
Have
you
the
so
best
much.
day ever,
Thank
everyone.
Good to see you, Lisa, as
you.
always. Bye.
Bye for now.